There's a moment in every person's life when the world goes quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that falls right before something breaks. The kind where every sound drops away and all that's left is one voice. Just one, coming through static and distance and 30 years of people saying you don't belong here. This is a story about that voice, and about the woman who refused to stop speaking. Her name was Vera Alexieva, born in 1951 in a small factory town in the Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union. The kind of place where the smoke from the steel plant never fully left the sky, where the air tasted like iron even on Sundays, where girls were handed two futures at birth and told to pick one, the kitchen or the factory floor. Her father worked at the communications relay station on the edge of town, a quiet man with large hands and a habit of listening to frequencies nobody else could hear. On cold nights, he would press a pair of old headphones against Vera's ears and tell her to be still. Listen, he'd say, the world is talking. Most people never learn how to hear it. She heard it. By the time she was 9 years old, Vera could identify a radio signal's origin by its interference pattern alone. By 12, she was copying Morse code faster than most men at the relay station. By 14, she had taken apart and reassembled the family's shortwave receiver 3 times, each time improving something her father hadn't noticed was broken. He watched her work without saying much. He was not a man who gave compliments easily. But sometimes late at night, she would catch him watching her with an expression that looked like poorly disguised as pride. The town had opinions about this. Women were not radio operators. That was simply a fact of the world, the way that water ran downhill and the Communist Party organized the harvest schedule. It wasn't a rule anyone had written down because no one needed to write it down. It was the kind of rule that lived in the way men at the station fell silent when Vera walked in the way her school's technical instructor redirected her questions toward home economics, in the way her mother pressed her lips together every time Vera mentioned the radio, and changed the subject to whether the neighbor's son had shown any interest yet. Vera was not interested in the neighbor's son. She was interested in the gap between transmission and reception, in the 3-second delay that lived inside long-distance communication, in the way human voices turned into mathematics and then turned back into human voices on the other end, and somehow, miraculously, the meaning survived the journey. She applied to the State Communications Institute in Moscow in 1968. The admissions officer, a man with reading glasses perched on the end of the nose that had been broken and reset at least twice, looked at her application for a long time without speaking. Then, he looked at her. Then, back at the application. This program, he said carefully, is not suited for women. I know, Vera said. I applied anyway. He did not approve her application that day. He would not approve it for 2 more years, during which time Vera worked at the local relay station as a filing clerk, which meant she filed things in the morning and listened to everything she was not supposed to hear in the afternoon. She learned the night frequency schedules. She learned which operators were sloppy and which ones were precise. She learned that the man who worked the midnight shift had a tremor in his left hand that made his Morse code identifiable from 300 kilometers away. She filed this information carefully, in her head, not in the folders. When she finally arrived in Moscow in 1970 with a suitcase, a bedroll, and a letter of conditional acceptance, conditional being a word that had been underlined twice as though she might not understand its weight. She was 20 years old, and she had already been told she didn't belong somewhere so many times that the words had stopped landing. They bounced off. She had grown a kind of surface for them. The institute was a gray building near the Novoslobodskaya metro station, surrounded by birch trees that were already going gold in the September air. Vera stood outside it for exactly 4 minutes. She counted. Then, she picked up her suitcase and walked in. The program had 63 students. 4 of them were women. Of those 4, only Vera was in the advanced transmission track. The other 3 were in administrative communications, which was considered appropriate. When Vera sat down in the advanced transmission classroom on the first morning, the instructor, a colonel-grade officer named Borodin who had spent 14 years in military signals intelligence, looked at her with the expression of a man who has opened a cupboard expecting flour and found a live bird inside. He did not ask her to leave. He made it clear, without using any words, that he expected her to fail. This was a miscalculation on his part. What Colonel Borodin did not know, what none of them knew, because Vera had never announced it, was that she had been practicing for this exact classroom for 6 years. Every frequency she had listened to in her father's relay station. Every transmission she had decoded on the family's shortwave set. Every equipment diagram she had memorized from the technical manuals she was not supposed to have borrowed from the station storage room. All of it lived inside her, organized with a precision that most people reserve for things they are afraid to lose. She was not afraid of losing it. She had built it too deep. The first month was a kind of warfare conducted entirely through indirection. Borodin gave assignments and called on the men first, always cycling through them in a pattern that made Vera last or skipped her entirely. The male students, most of them the sons of military officers or Communist Party officials, young men who had arrived at the institute with the comfortable certainty of people who have never been told no, treated her with a range of responses that went from puzzled dismissal to active irritation. One of them, a broad-shouldered boy from Leningrad named Petrov, who wore his confidence like a second uniform, made a habit of correcting her during group exercises even when she was right. Especially when she was right. He did it casually, without malice, the way you might swat a fly. Not out of hatred, but out of reflex. She was an inconvenience in his peripheral vision. Vera noted this, filed it, said nothing. What she did instead was perform. Not in a showy way, not with her hand always raised and her voice always loudest. She performed the way a tuning fork performs. You strike it, and the right frequency rings out, clean and undeniable. When Borodin finally called on her in the third week, clearly expecting a gap, she answered before he finished the question. Not with aggression, with precision, the kind that has no argument. The room went quiet in a different way than it had before. Borodin moved on without commenting. But he didn't skip her again. By November, she had the highest transmission accuracy score in the class. Not the highest among women. The highest. Period. Her Morse code output was measured at 42 words per minute with a 99.3% accuracy rate. Petrov was at 38 words per minute. He checked her score 3 times on the post-it board, looking for an error the way you look for a loose thread on an otherwise perfect seam. He found none. He stopped correcting her after that. He didn't apologize. Men like Petrov didn't apologize. They simply redirected their attention elsewhere. Vera didn't need the apology. She needed the silence, and she got it. But silence from Petrov was not silence from the world. The faculty meetings she was not supposed to know about discussed her unusual situation. The dormitory's female section had exactly 8 beds and was located on a different floor than the male students, with a separate stairwell that felt like an afterthought, which it was. The women's bathroom in the technical wing had been a storage closet 3 months before Vera arrived, and the conversion had been done so recently that the paint still smelled chemical on cold mornings. She knew all of this. She logged it without bitterness, the way a navigator logs weather conditions, useful information, not a reason to change course. What she was building in those months in Moscow was not just technical competence. It was something harder to measure. It was the understanding of how to operate inside a system that did not want her there without becoming something the system had made. There is a difference between adaptation and surrender, and Vera understood this difference at a cellular level. She adapted her methods. She never adapted her direction. The winter of 1970 was brutal even by Moscow standards. January temperatures dropped to -30. The heating in the dormitory failed twice. Vera studied in her coat, her breath fogging the diagrams she had spread across her desk, her fingers moving through transmission sequences on a practice pad while her classmates slept or complained or wrote letters home asking for warmer clothes. She did not write letters home asking for warmer clothes. She wrote letters home describing the interference patterns she had observed during the Institute's long-range transmission exercises, asking her father whether he had noticed similar behavior in the Ural frequencies. He wrote back with careful technical observations that filled 4 pages of graph paper in his small, precise handwriting. Nobody at the Institute knew about these letters. Nobody knew that she had been conducting an informal research project into atmospheric interference since she was 15, building a dataset in a series of school composition notebooks that were now stored in a box under her childhood bed 2,000 kilometers away. Knowledge, Vera had understood for a long time, was the only thing nobody could take away from you once you had hidden it well enough. She hid hers in plain sight, in her work, in her scores, in the way she sat in Borodin's class, and answered questions with the quiet, unshowable confidence of someone who already knows what the answer is because she learned it years before the question was asked. The spring examination came in April. It was a practical test, simulate a long-distance transmission under degraded signal conditions, maintain contact, relay a full navigational update package. The kind of scenario that would be meaningless in a classroom and critical in the field. Vera did it in 11 minutes. The previous record was 17. Borodin stood in the back of the room with his hands clasped behind him and his face doing something complicated. He said nothing to her directly. At the graduation ceremony in June, he shook every student's hand. When he got to Vera, he held her hand 1 second longer than the others. "You're going to have a very difficult career," he said. "I know," she said. He almost smiled. Almost. She took her diploma, Certified State Communications Specialist, Advanced Transmission Track, and put it in the same suitcase she had carried from the Urals. Then, she went to find the next place that would tell her she didn't belong. She was 21 years old. She had not yet done the thing that mattered. That would come later, in a different kind of cold, over a frequency nobody else thought to maintain, in a night that would stretch long enough for everyone to learn what her voice was actually worth. She would make them wait for it. The world had made her wait long enough. The assignment came in a manila envelope with 3 stamps and no return address. That was how you knew it was serious. Serious things arrived without return addresses, as though the people sending them did not want to be found if the serious thing went wrong. Vera opened it at the small kitchen table of the one-room apartment she had been assigned in a communications workers' housing block in Novosibirsk. The apartment smelled like the previous tenant's cabbage soup, and the ambitions of a building designed purely for function. Concrete walls, a single window that faced another concrete wall, a radiator that clicked and argued with itself from October through April. She had lived in worse. She had lived in the Ural dormitory during the winter Borodin's heating broke, after all. She read the envelope's contents twice. Then, she made tea. Then, she read it a third time. The posting was to Novaya Station 7, a high-frequency relay and monitoring point positioned along the Arctic Communications Corridor, roughly 1,200 kilometers above the Arctic Circle, on the western edge of the Taimyr Peninsula. The station's function was part weather monitoring, part long-range navigation support for Soviet Arctic maritime operations, part signals intelligence relay, the kind of multi-purpose assignment that existed because the Soviet communications infrastructure in the high Arctic was thin enough that every installation had to justify itself 3 ways before anyone would pay to heat it. The station had a crew of 9. It had never had a female crew member. The letter informed her of this fact in a single sentence that was clearly meant to function as a warning. Crew composition is currently all male. Accommodations will require adjustment. What kind of adjustment? The letter did not specify. She put the letter back in the envelope. Put the envelope in the suitcase. Started packing. The journey took 11 days. Train to Krasnoyarsk. Military transport aircraft to Katanga. From Katanga, a twin-engine supply plane whose pilot was a man named Gennady, who had the easy confidence of someone who has been terrifying passengers for so long that terror no longer reaches him. The plane flew low over the tundra because flying higher required equipment Gennady's plane didn't have, and the landscape below was the color of old bone, flat, enormous, indifferent in a way that only geography can be indifferent. Vera looked at it through the scratched porthole window and did not feel afraid. She felt located. There was something about the tundra that matched a frequency she recognized. The absence of ornament. The absolute honesty of the cold. Nothing out here was pretending to be something it wasn't. The land was exactly as hostile as it looked, which meant you knew precisely what you were dealing with. She had lived her entire professional life surrounded by things pretending to be welcoming while working very hard to push her out. The Arctic at least would not pretend. Station 7 was 8 low buildings arranged in a horseshoe around a central equipment hall, all of them painted a red that had faded to the color of dried blood against the white. The antenna array rose above the complex like a series of iron arguments against the sky. When the supply plane landed on the packed gravel airstrip, 3 of the 9 crew members came out to meet it. They were expecting supplies. They were not expecting Vera. The crew chief, a barrel-shaped Siberian named Marchenko, 44 years old, with a beard that appeared to have formed as a survival mechanism against the cold rather than a stylistic choice, looked at Vera for a long time. Then, he looked at the manifest in his hand. Then, back at Vera. "You're the new signal specialist," he said. "Yes," Vera said. He looked at the manifest again. "Alex Siva." "Yes." A longer pause. "The kind that has a shape. The accommodation situation," he said finally, "is going to require some adjustment." "So I was told," she said. "What kind of adjustment?" Marchenko scratched his beard. The two men behind him found interesting things to look at in the middle distance. We have one extra sleeping room. It was being used as equipment storage. We can clear it. That works, Varys said. He nodded. Something in his expression shifted. Not warmth exactly, more like a recalibration. He had been prepared for a different kind of response, and her straightforwardness had disrupted his preparation. He extended his hand. She shook it. The storage room became her room in 3 hours. It smelled like machine oil and old packing foam for the first 2 weeks. She didn't mind. She had grown up in a factory town. Machine oil was practically a childhood scent. The crew's reactions arranged themselves along a predictable spectrum. Marchenko was businesslike. He had decided to be professional about it, and professionalism was a commitment he made completely once he made it all. A young technician named Ilya, barely 22, was openly curious about her equipment calibration methods and asked good technical questions that she answered without condescension. A weather analyst named Drozdov was cold. Not the hostile cold of someone who had decided to make her life difficult, but the cold of someone who simply did not believe she was supposed to be there and had resolved to interact with her as minimally as possible until events proved him right. She was familiar with all three types. The one she paid most attention to was a man named Volkov, senior signals technician, 12 years at various Arctic postings, a face that had been rearranged by weather into something that looked like a topographic map of high-altitude terrain. He said almost nothing to her for the first week. He watched, though, with the focused attention of someone conducting an assessment. On the 8th day, she was recalibrating the primary frequency oscillator, a finicky piece of equipment that had been drifting in its output by a consistent 0.3 kilohertz, which nobody at the station had identified as a problem because the drift had been so gradual over 2 years that it had become invisible, and Volkov appeared in the doorway of the equipment room. He watched her work for 5 minutes. "You found the oscillator drift," he said. "It's been drifting since at least 1972 based on the maintenance logs," she said without looking up. The logs record it as a calibration variance, but nobody corrected for it. The signal output at the far end of the corridor would be degraded by the cumulative effect. A pause. "Nobody else caught that," Volkov said. "I know." Another pause, this one different in texture from the first. "The logs are in the third cabinet from the left," he said. "Chronological. If you need the 1971 baseline frequencies for comparison, they're in a separate folder at the back. It's not labeled. Green folder." He left without waiting for a response. That was Volkov's version of welcome. She accepted it. The work at Station 7 was unglamorous in the way that all genuinely important work is unglamorous. It was monitoring and maintenance and calibration and the transmission of position data to ships navigating the Kara Sea and the Eastern Barents. It was 4-hour shifts in the main signals room with its bank of receivers and the constant, rhythmic pulse of position beacons from vessels she would never see. It was troubleshooting equipment that had been designed in the 1960s and maintained in conditions that were doing their level best to destroy it. Vera was good at this. Not good the way people are good at things they've been taught. Good the way people are good at things they've grown into over a decade of obsessive attention. The kind of good that looks like instinct because the thinking behind it has been done so many times it no longer requires visible effort. She started keeping a supplementary log, not the official maintenance record. She kept that meticulously in the green folder behind the labeled folders where Volkov had shown her the baseline frequencies. A second log, in a composition notebook of the same type she had used since childhood, in which she recorded her observations about the station's signal behavior under varying atmospheric and weather conditions. The Arctic, she had quickly discovered, did things to radio frequencies that lower latitudes did not. The ionosphere up here behaved like a restless sea. It shifted and bent and occasionally threw signals back at the ground from completely unexpected angles. Understanding it required patience and a willingness to record data without expecting it to immediately make sense. She was good at delayed sense-making. She had practice. Ilya noticed the second notebook and asked about it. She explained. He started contributing observations from the weather monitoring side, temperature inversions, atmosphere pressure gradients, aurora borealis activity, correlating with frequency behavior. Within 2 months, they had an informal research collaboration that neither of them had named because naming it felt like it might make someone uncomfortable. Drozdov remained cold. She let him. Marchenko, who had started asking her questions about equipment issues with increasing frequency, one afternoon showed up with a second cup of tea that he set on her workbench without comment. She drank it without comment. This was the established vocabulary of Station 7, and she had learned to speak it fluently. The first crisis came in October. An ice-class research vessel, the academic Fyodorov, was navigating the northern shipping lane in deteriorating weather when its primary navigation receiver failed. The ship had backup systems. All Soviet Arctic vessels were required to maintain them. But the backup system was also showing anomalous readings that the ship's own communications officer couldn't reconcile. The vessel was making a position report that didn't match Station 7's calculated position data. And in the Arctic, a position disagreement of even a few kilometers could mean the difference between open water and sea ice thick enough to breach a hull. The call came in on a Tuesday evening. Wind outside running at 40 kilometers per hour, temperature -28, the kind of night where the station's windows hummed under pressure. The duty signals operator, a reliable but not exceptional man named Kashin, had been working the problem for 20 minutes without resolution when Vera came into the signals room to start her equipment check. She read the situation in about 15 seconds, not from any dramatic insight, from the simple fact that she had spent 2 months studying exactly the kind of atmospheric anomaly that was currently distorting the Fyodorov's received positioning signal. The ionospheric layer is bouncing the positioning signal, she said. The ship's receiver is picking up a reflected signal on top of the primary. It's reading both and averaging them. That's where the position error is coming from. Kashin looked at her. How do you know that? She pointed at the atmospheric data on the adjacent monitor, the aurora activity levels, the pressure gradient readings from Ilya's weather section, and walked him through the relationship in 90 seconds. He understood it in 60 and spent the last 30 staring at her. She took the communications chair. Over the next 4 hours, she walked the Fyodorov's navigation team through a manual position verification process that used a different frequency band, one less susceptible to the specific anomaly affecting their primary system. It required calculating corrections in real time, accounting for signal drift, adjusting for the ship's reported heading and speed, and maintaining a continuous transmission link in conditions that were doing their best to disrupt it. The wind picked up to 60 kilometers per hour. The antenna array rattled. Ilya brought her tea and a bowl of soup that she ate with one hand while running the correction calculations with the other. The Fyodorov made safe harbor at its scheduled anchorage at 2:47 in the morning. Marchenko was in the signals room for the last hour of it. He had come in at midnight, ostensibly to check something, and stayed. He stood against the back wall with his arms crossed, and his face doing the complicated thing that Borodin's face had done years before in Moscow. The expression of a man encountering something his existing categories don't quite contain. When the Fyodorov transmitted its harbor confirmation, Vera leaned back in the chair and let out a breath that she hadn't been aware of holding. Marchenko uncrossed his arms. "Good work," he said. It was not said carelessly. It landed with weight. Drozdov, who had also materialized at some point in the last hour without Vera noticing, said nothing. But he picked up the communications log and noted the resolution of the incident in precise, careful handwriting. He dated and signed it. He used her full name and rang for the first time. She noticed. She filed it. She did not react. Volkov, she learned the next morning, had been awake the entire time in his bunk next door, listening through the wall to the frequency of her voice on the transmitter, the steadiness of it, the clarity of it, the way it didn't change register between the moments of uncertainty and the moments of resolution. He didn't tell her this directly. He told Ilya, who told her, who processed it in the same way she processed everything, as data. Accurate, important, not for immediate use. What mattered was the Fyodorov was safe. What mattered was the notebook, her second notebook, the one Ilya had asked about, had given her what she needed to solve the problem before it became a catastrophe. What also mattered, though she would not have been able to articulate it then, without the risk of jinxing something she couldn't afford to jinx, was that for 4 hours in a signals room above the Arctic Circle, in the middle of a Siberian night, while the wind tried its best to tear the antenna array off the roof, nobody had asked her if she was supposed to be there. She had simply been there, doing the thing. For 4 hours, the question of whether she belonged had been answered by the answer itself, by the Fyodorov sitting safe in harbor, its crew asleep, its hull intact, guided home by a frequency she had managed and a voice she had refused, for 23 years, to lower. She went to bed at 4 in the morning. She was back in the signals room by 8. There was a calibration that needed finishing. Word travels the way radio signals travel. Not in straight lines, not at constant speed, not through empty air, but bouncing off layers it was never designed to touch, arriving in places it was never expected to reach, sometimes stronger for having traveled the longer path. Vera had spent her professional life studying this phenomenon. She had not expected to become an example of it. The report Marchenko filed after the Fyodorov incident was 3 pages long. It detailed the atmospheric conditions, the technical nature of the navigation error, and the resolution method. It named Vera in the second paragraph and described her contribution in language that Marchenko, a man whose relationship with adjectives was purely functional, had apparently wrestled with before deploying. Specialist Alexieva demonstrated exceptional diagnostic capacity under time-critical conditions, resolving a complex signal interference problem through a combination of real-time atmospheric analysis and precise frequency management that prevented what could have been a significant navigational incident. The report went to the Regional Communications Directorate in Krasnoyarsk. From there, a summary went to the Arctic Marine Navigation Coordination Center in Murmansk. From there, a notation went into the incident record that the Fyodorov's own command structure filed. The captain of the Fyodorov, a meticulous Latvian named Ozels who had been navigating Arctic waters for 21 years and believed that credit, like fault, should be assigned with precision, added his own supplementary note to the incident file, in which he stated that the station operator who had guided them through the position correction had demonstrated the kind of calm competence that was, in his experience, rare at sea and apparently equally rare on land. He did not know her name. He asked. Someone found it. Vera, in her storage room turned sleeping room, knew none of this was happening. She was working on her secondary log. She was noting a new pattern in the ionospheric activity that seemed to correlate with specific wind shear events at altitude. She was drinking tea that had gone cold because she had forgotten to drink it while she was writing. Winter arrived on the Taimyr Peninsula the way it always did. Not gradually, but all at once, like a door slamming. November darkness was absolute by 3 in the afternoon, and by December the sun barely cleared the horizon even at noon, a pale coin of light that offered illumination without warmth and then withdrew. The temperature settled into the -40s and stayed there with the patience of something that knows it has months. The station crew went interior. This happened every winter. The world outside contracted to a white void that was occasionally visible through fogged windows, and the 8 buildings of Station 7 became the entire habitable universe. People who would have maintained careful distances in summer found themselves sharing meals and silences with the automatic intimacy of people who simply have no other options. Vera had been warned about this before she arrived. She had not been warned correctly, because there was no way to describe it correctly. You had to live it to understand what it did to the social architecture of 9 people sealed inside a horseshoe of low buildings by a darkness that lasted 19 hours a day. What it did to Vera, specifically, was this: it made the men around her forget, on an operational level, that she was unusual. Not because they stopped noticing she was a woman, but because in winter, at -45, with the heating system requiring Ilya's attention every 3rd day, and the main transmitter developing a new and creative complaint every week, there was simply too much work to maintain the category of woman who shouldn't be here, with the diligence it required. She was there. She fixed things. The transmitter worked. The signals went out and came back. The heating worked, mostly. The tea was hot, except when she forgot it. She became, in the wordless grammar of Station 7's winter operations, a fact. Volkov began discussing technical problems with her directly, not as a performance of acceptance, but because she was the most useful person to discuss them with. His 12 years in the Arctic had given him experiential knowledge that her formal training didn't cover, and her formal training had given her theoretical frameworks that his experience didn't provide, and the combination of the two turned out to be more practically useful than either alone. They developed a working method that consisted largely of one of them presenting a problem and the other asking questions until the shape of the solution became visible. Neither of them had a word for this. They didn't need one. Drozdov remained formally correct, not cold anymore, just careful in the way of a man who has revised an opinion and is not yet certain what to replace it with. He still said less to her than to anyone else on the crew, but his less had a different quality to it, watchful rather than dismissive. She understood this too. Some recalibrations took longer than others. In January, the second crisis happened, and unlike the first one, which had been urgent and contained a 4-hour emergency with a clear resolution. The second one was the kind that builds slowly and then breaks all at once, the kind you don't fully understand until you're already inside it. It began with weather. It always began with weather above the Arctic Circle in January. The weather was not a background condition, but a primary actor, a protagonist with its own agenda, and an absolute indifference to human planning. A massive storm system had been tracking across the Kara Sea for 6 days, and the Northern Fleet had 2 vessels in the affected zone, a polar research ship and an ice-breaking supply vessel supporting a remote drilling operation. Both ships had been in contact with Station 7 through the storm, routine check-ins, nothing alarming. The kind of contact that lulls you into believing the situation is managed. The lull ended at 11:17 on a Thursday night. The polar research ship Dmitry Laptev transmitted an emergency position report. Its primary communications array had sustained storm damage. Its GPS navigation, the newer system the vessel had been retrofitted with the previous year, was down. Its backup magnetic compass was behaving erratically, which in polar latitudes was not unusual, because magnetic north up here was more a suggestion than a fact, but was alarming when combined with a blinded ship in gale force conditions and a coastline that, on this section of the Taimyr, presented as a succession of ice shells that did not show up on radar until you were too close to them. 14 men on the Dmitry Laptev. The second ship, the icebreaker, was 2 hours away and could not safely increase speed in the current sea state. Vera was already in the signals room. She had started her night shift at 11, when Kashin took the emergency transmission. She had the secondary log open on the desk beside her. She had been tracking the atmospheric behavior through the storm for 6 days. The pages of the notebook were dense with numbers and correlations and 3 or 4 theories about ionospheric compression that she had not yet been able to test. She was about to test them. Marchenko came in 4 minutes after the emergency transmission. Volkov 2 minutes after that. Nobody had called them. The station had a way, in critical moments, of assembling itself. The situation was this. The Dmitry Laptev had lost its ability to fix its own position. It knew its approximate location from its last reliable reading 6 hours earlier, and it knew its heading and speed since then, but dead reckoning in a storm at night with variable currents was... The ship's own navigation officer transmitted this assessment in a voice that was steady and, therefore, more frightening than panic would have been. An educated guess. An educated guess was not sufficient. Not with ice shelves in the area. Standard protocol for a navigation emergency of this type was to relay the vessel's dead reckoning position to the nearest coastal station, have that station cross-reference with known maritime traffic and environmental data, and provide a corrected position estimate. It was a straightforward procedure when the standard tools were working. The standard tools were not working. The storm had compressed the ionosphere in exactly the pattern Vera had been tracking for 6 days. The compression created a reflective layer that was bending the signals she would normally use for position triangulation back at angles that made conventional cross-referencing impossible. The numbers simply didn't resolve. Kashin had tried for 8 minutes before Vera recognized what he was seeing and understood why it wasn't working. "Stop," she said. Kashin stopped. Marchenko and Volkov looked at her. She picked up the secondary notebook, found page 43, a Tuesday entry 10 days ago, in which she had sketched a theoretical frequency response curve for this specific type of ionospheric compression. She had been working on it because it interested her, because the Arctic atmosphere did things that deserved understanding, not because she had imagined she would need it in the next 10 days with 14 lives as the stakes. She looked at the curve. She looked at the frequency array. She looked at the storm data on Ilya's weather monitor. Ilya had appeared at the doorway, barefoot, in a thermal undershirt, with the expression of someone who has been in this job long enough to wake up when the atmosphere changes. "Ilya," she said, "what's the upper-level wind shear at 8,000 meters?" He looked at his readings, told her, and the pressure gradient between here and the Laptev's last known position. He told her. She did 4 calculations on the page of the notebook. Not slowly, quickly, but the calculations themselves were dense, built on the 6 days of observations she had been making. Volkov watched this. His face was doing the thing faces do when they witness competence operating at a level they respect and cannot fully follow. "I need to use LF band," she said. "Low frequency. The compression is bending the HF signals, but at LF the atmospheric layer behaves differently. The compression actually increases the ground wave range. We can use it to triangulate the Loptev's position if we use 3 reference points. She named 3 other stations in the communications network, 2 further along the Arctic corridor, 1 on the Novaya Zemlya archipelago, whose cooperation she would need. I have no authorization to directly redirect those stations, Marchenko said. Not a refusal. A statement of administrative reality. No, Vera agreed. But you can request the emergency coordination. The request required a communication to the Northern Fleet Maritime Coordination Center in Murmansk, which required waking up someone in Murmansk who had the authority to direct the other stations, which required explaining the technical situation to someone who would have to trust the explanation without understanding it. Marchenko made the call. He explained it. When the person in Murmansk asked for the technical basis of the proposed approach, Marchenko said, without hesitation, without visible uncertainty, my signals specialist has 6 days of documented atmospheric data supporting this method. I'm authorizing the approach. The authorization came through in 11 minutes. Vera coordinated 3 stations across a 900-kilometer stretch of Arctic coast over the next hour and 40 minutes. She directed the triangulation procedure in a frequency band that nobody in the standard emergency protocol had anticipated using because the atmospheric conditions required to make it work were unusual enough that most operators would never encounter them. She was patient over the radio, unhurried, exact, correcting errors in the other station's calibration without impatience, because impatience on an emergency frequency costs time that cannot be bought back. The Dmitry Loptev's position was fixed at 1:03 in the morning. The position was 3.2 kilometers east of where the ship's own dead reckoning had placed it. That meant it was also 3.2 kilometers further from the ice shelf than the navigation officer had estimated. There was a margin, not a comfortable margin. The ship's officer transmitted that it was the sort of margin that makes you religious if you weren't already, but a margin. The icebreaker arrived at 3:40 and escorted the Loptev to open water. All 14 men. Safe. In the signals room of Station 7, with the wind still running at 50 kilometers per hour outside, and the temperature at -47, and the coffee Volkov had made at midnight sitting cold and forgotten on the desk, nobody said anything for a moment. Then, Ilya, who was still barefoot on the cold floor, made a sound that was technically a breath, but functioned as a celebration. Marchenko uncrossed his arms. Alexieva, he said. She turned. Your notebook. He nodded at the composition book on the desk, the one with page 43 and the theoretical frequency response curve she had sketched on a Tuesday, because the Arctic atmosphere was interesting. How long have you been building that? The one I'm currently working in, she said, since I arrived here. The method goes back further. About 8 years. He absorbed this. 8 years, Volkov said, from his position against the wall. It was not a question. It was a man doing an internal recalculation. Drozdov was in the doorway. She had not noticed him enter. He was holding his own mug in both hands, and his face had lost the careful watchfulness and was showing something she had not seen there before. It had the look of an emotion he was probably not planning to name. He didn't name it. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, that was good work. 3 words. The same 3 words Marchenko had used after the Fyodorov. But from Drozdov's mouth, in Drozdov's careful voice, they arrived with different weight. They arrived like something being set down after a long carry. Vera accepted them, filed them, did not let them land on her face as anything but acknowledgement. Inside, in the place she kept things that were not for the signals room, it was different. Inside, it landed the way the first warm day of spring lands. Not gently, but with a kind of authority. Like proof of something you had known was coming, but had not been certain enough to count on until it arrived. She turned back to the transmitter. There were reports to log, calibration data to record. The storm was still running, and the secondary systems needed checking. She had work to do. She always had work to do. That had never been the question.